and and recreation. So I am going to turn it over to Kayla to provide her introduction, and then we're going to actually share in the chat a resource that will take everyone through today and provide a little more context around.
Awesome. Thank you, Krista. I am Kayla, Krista's colleague. I am the Education Development Manager at Move United. I am a white female with brown curly hair. I am sitting in a virtual office with the Move United logo in the background and a brick wall behind me. And we'll explain in just a minute why we use that format of introduction. But again, super excited to be here and to join you guys. Thanks for having us. All right, and Krista, if you're able to share that handout in the chat.
Pulling it up now. Technology today. It's coming, I promise.
That's all right. If we're not able to share it in the chat, I can screen share, no problem.
Yeah, the screen's not pulling up, so failure all around.
Okay, all good. I'll pull up the screen share. Krista, if you want to give an overview, a little bit about Move United.
So what we have that we're pulling or attempting to pull up here is an accessibility tracker. And this checklist is really used or can be used to help make sure that your organization is providing both virtually and in person accessibility best practices for anyone that's in the room with you. There are currently 1 in 4 people in the United States that have a disability. Disability is not equitable. It happens in communities, or people in communities have a higher rate of disability if you are Black or African American, Indigenous, or of the Hispanic and Latinx community. So we know that because of our population, because of the demographics we serve, we always want to make sure that we are being as most accessible as possible. So when we present out on our education conference, on our other virtual conferences, in meetings, these are some best practices to try and consider and include whenever possible, knowing that not every time it will be perfect, but as close to providing full list of accommodations as possible. And Kayla will be able to take everyone through kind of 4 different quadrants of what you can consider. And then we'll show you a little demo on how to make that actually happen and teach you hopefully a new tip or trick before we go.
Great, thanks, Krista. Yeah, as Krista mentioned, we've worked a lot in the event space internally and externally with other partners, and noticed there was a pretty decent gap in understanding of what an accessible presentation or session looks like. So we put this together this year and hope they're able to benefit from it. But one of the first things we identified is that typically what is most accessible for an introduction is when you start out and you introduce some of the following information. So you'll say your name, you can share your pronouns if you're comfortable with that, doing a visual description of who you are and what's around you, so that if you have attendees who have visual impairments or are blind, they're able to understand what the setting is in front of them. Any content warning for sensitive materials, if that's relevant. Introducing your position and your organization, like we did in our introductions, as well as the title of your presentation. And you're definitely welcome to add any other identifiers as you are comfortable with. But to give you an introduction again, I could say, my name is Kayla. I'm the Education Development Manager at Move United. So I mentioned I'm a white female with brown curly hair, wearing a white polo. Behind me is a conference table, a room with a Move United logo, a brick wall behind me, just kind of giving a description of what's around you in that setting. For the actual content of your presentation, it's really important that you provide alt text on all images and graphics in the presentation itself. So typically, if you're working off of a Mac, you can just right-click an image and say you have an image of an athlete playing soccer. You would want to type into that description, athlete running, kicking the ball on a soccer field, so that if an attendee is using a screen reader, their screen reader will pick up on that alt text and they'll be able, again, to understand what's on the slide in front of them. For attendees who may have a visual impairment or are blind, you want to make sure that your text is not too small. Typically that's font size 22 plus, and also that you've used an accessible font, which is typically a font that is clear and easy to read. If you do have video in your presentation, you'll want to make sure that you have closed captioning, and that it's available to all attendees in case you have attendees who are tuning in who might be deaf or hard of hearing. If it's not available, because I know as we've transitioned to this virtual world, there's some platforms that don't have closed captioning available. It'll be important to provide a transcript to attendees. And then additionally, any hashtags that you have to make sure that in the hashtag, the first letters are capitalized, again, for the screen readers. And then for your actual presentation, when you're sharing information with your attendees, it'll be important to be very visible and in good light when you speak, so that participants can see your face and so that there's really good contrast. Avoid distracting backgrounds such as bright sunlight or flashing light. And usually we recommend to presenters that they test this out with a colleague or a friend before getting on the session, so that you know what the situation is going to look like and you're not scrambling once you get on screen. When you are going through presentation, you'll want to describe any graphics that are on your slides. So say, again, if you have a volleyball player on your presentation, you'll want to start out and say, on this slide in front of me is a seated volleyball player hitting the volleyball over the net with another athlete on the other side of the net waiting to receive. If there is any other visual information on the screen, such as a poll or a chart, you'll want to describe that as well, again, keeping in mind that some individuals may not be able to physically see the slides in front of them. And then finally, for your Q&A, it's going to be important that you read the question aloud before answering. Similar reasons, so that everybody has an understanding of what subject matter you're addressing. If anyone is speaking, they should start by saying their name for the captioner. So say we transitioned and Krista started speaking, say, hey, it's Krista speaking, and then go into the content that she's going to present. And then you'll want to mention, if you do have closed captioning available, again, that it is available, and how you'll access it through the presentation. And then when you are speaking in your session, it's really important that you speak slowly and clearly, so that the closed captioning services pick up on what you're speaking. And we have a little bit more to present. I'll turn it over to Krista to share that bit.
Thanks, Kayla. And this is Krista, and I am going to cover the materials portion of this checklist. And I should also mention that all 4 quadrants that Kayla just discussed, they should hold true whether you're presenting in person, in a room with someone, on a virtual call with a colleague, or in an actual event space. So they are best practices both virtually and in person. But specifically for virtual materials, this bottom piece rings true in the Zoom error. So to create accessible documents, you can actually, as Kayla mentioned, utilize a lot of built-in technology features. So whether that is on Adobe PDF, PowerPoint, Word, they all have trackers that will check and see if there are any issues. So whether you're putting together slides or agendas, worksheets, terminology lists, you should make sure that they have the full accessibility features in them that Kayla went over for your content. And then you could complete a check accessibility run on your PowerPoint or PDF. And then what is a best practice is uploading all of those accessible materials to a folder prior to a presentation. And of course, trying as best as possible not to change them in between, so that if an individual or a colleague or someone in your audience needs to use a screen reader, or needs to have that type of accommodation where they have the materials, even if they're just looking to increase the font size and do large print, that they have access to those materials. So Kayla, if you would switch off your share screen, I'm going to attempt to open my PowerPoint. And I could show you all very quickly where, here we go, where everything lies. So there are a couple different places that you could do this. You could do this on a Microsoft Windows computer. You could do it on a MacBook. You could do it in Google Drive, for example, if you use Google Slides. But at the end of the day, it all runs pretty much the same. So if you are on here we have just like a brief overview slide, a couple of slides of Kayla and myself. We have an introductory slide and a little slide about who Move United is. So if I had created this document and I had put in all the images, the text, to check that it has met the accessibility features, I will go to File, and this is for Windows. There is a Check for Issues button, and then you could click Check Accessibility. And what will happen is on the right-hand side of your screen, you'll see a bunch of errors come up. So we left this one completely untouched so that we can go through the type of errors that might come up. So you then will see all the pictures or images listed that don't have alt text, for example. And what you could do is you can click into it and you'll see, okay, this picture is highlighted. And to edit the alt text, you right click the image, go down to the last menu item that says Format Picture with the paint can and the paint brush next to it, click that. And then at the top menu here, there is a square box with two size property rulers. So when you click that, there's an alt text button. And here, PowerPoint auto-generated a picture containing person, fence, outdoor grass, and doesn't give it a title. So I would update this to say an image of an adaptive track and field athlete with a running blade, outdoors on a track competing in a competition. And you could go into as more descriptive as that, but that is kind of like the bare minimum. And so you would go through and you would click these missing captions, give it a alt text. So that's the really common one that comes up for accessibility. Another one is the slide title. So here you can go in and, oops, sorry, exit that. So you could go in and title your slides on the back end of PowerPoint. And then it also gives you some tips. So there is a brief animated video here. This is reminding you to ensure that you have closed captioning or a transcript available. And then it's just reminding you to check the reading order to make sure that slide titles are navigatable, and that when someone who is just looking for looking at the slides from the perspective of text, shapes, and content, they understand the order and the flow of your documents. So how you would do that on a MacBook, which I am not on, but essentially you would just right click the image, and in the middle of the menu that pops up, it directly says edit alt text. So you just enter it that way. And on Google Slides, it translates the same way. You just right click on the image and add the alt text. So we like to check that our PowerPoints, when we're both virtual and in person, have the accessibility features turned on. Once again, this was a demo without them to show you where everything is. But it is really helpful, and not a lot of organizations realize, both large and small, that this is a feature and a way to include people with disabilities and make them feel included. So it's something that we recommend as a best practice. And this is something that we've really pivoted to in the last 16 months as we've gone into the virtual space and not been able to do our usual in-person events. So this is just a really brief overview, and we're more than happy to answer any questions that anyone has. I know we have like 4 minutes, but if there are any questions, Kayla and I can also enter our information in the chat, and you are more than welcome to reach out to us. And we could provide different resources and trainings on how to build both in-person and virtual accessibility options for your organization.
Does anyone have any questions for Kayla or Krista? There information going in the chat that you can put it in the chat or pop it up or pop off mute and ask out loud.
I have a question real quick, sorry. Let me put on my video too. Thanks for the information, by the way, but I was wondering what the response is to all of these little adjustments, because they seem like they make so much sense to when you're hearing this explanation of how they make meetings and presentations more accessible. But can I also see how a lot of people who have never had this kind of like even an introduction of saying, oh, I have brown curly hair and this is what my background looks like. I can see how people might not understand that or think it's clunky. And I'm wondering what the response has been on an aggregate across just business meetings, how people respond to it for the first time usually.
Yeah, we can give a couple different examples. So when we were introducing this for our education conference, we had about 78 presenters and we ran an accessibility meeting ahead of time to go through this. That's also another way to kind of calm people's nerves, go through it with them before, give everyone a chance to like script out what their opening and introduction, for example, could be, because if you've never done it before, you might have no idea what to say. Generally, when you go through it with folks that have never done it before, there is always a mixed crowd. So you have people that are like, oh yeah, I'm gonna go and I'm gonna click through every picture on my PowerPoint and update it. And then you have folks that are like, I have 50 slides and there's probably like 100 images. Do I have to go back and put it? So we always are encouraging of yes, you should. And a lot of times just hearing what the hesitation is, you can help alleviate that. So another example would be that someone was nervous that they had so many images and graphs on their PowerPoints that, you know, if they had to explain every single thing verbally, it would add 20 minutes to the presentation. And it's really a good reminder that anything you put on a PowerPoint, whether you're in person or on a virtual call, should be relevant to what you're explaining. So if there are things that you can take out because you wouldn't go into explanation, then you don't necessarily need them there. But then also it's a way to introduce material and to introduce what you're trying to show. So there's a couple different ways, usually by allowing people to practice ahead of time and taking that pressure off and saying, like, we know that you might miss one thing. Like, I'm a perfect example. I was so flustered from not being into the call that I didn't give the full explanation and introduction that I usually give of myself, right? So just allowing people to have that grace and to be like, okay, next time you can just add in this one extra thing, and then the time after that, one more. It's a good way to calm people and allow them to truly remember that it's about being accessible for other people.
Yeah. And I would just add to that, from an attendee end, a lot of the feedback we received was, wow, I never thought about that. That's so cool that they did that kind of introduction, and now I know to do that in the future. It's something that people, I think, generally hadn't really thought about, but when you see the consistency across different sessions and presentations, it just makes people more aware and educated on that aspect of accessibility, and then gives them the opportunity to implement that in their work organizations as well.
Awesome, thank you both.
This is a great question, thank you.
Do we have any other questions for Kayla or Krista? Well, their information is in the chat, and we'll also send this out afterwards. And then we have the checklist as well that we'll be able to send out so you can review it and use it, implement it in your strategies going forward. But we really do want to thank you both for joining and offering this, I thought was amazing information when I heard it for the first time just a couple months ago, about how to make sure that we're being inclusive to everyone as we're presenting and talking about the things that we do. And so thank you both so much for hopping on and joining us. We really do truly appreciate it. And then we're just going to transition here over to Jacob, and we'll let Jacob take it from here.
Cool. Thanks, Kim. And thanks other folks. The development's really great because it actually runs well into my session, but I hear that everyone has been sitting on this call for a while. So I'm going to make sure that mine is a little bit more discussion based. So I deal with kids all the time, not having their cameras on. So feel free to keep your cameras on or off, but I'll have some discussion here. So for the folks who are listening in, I'd love for some participation here. But just really quick, our program Rainbow Labs is trying to address the LGBTQ mentoring gap. For every 5,000 mentoring programs across the US, only 5 focus on LGBTQ kids. The pie is really small. And then when we talk about diversity and inclusion in the workplace and how that filters down to our kids, it's actually more challenging. So when we were launching our program this year, one thing we had noticed in Los Angeles, which relates really well with this conversation, is people are very hungry for, LGBTQ affirmation trainings, any kind of trainings they want in the workplace, because they don't have the skills to actually reach out to the kids in their programs and even how to approach them. So we've gone really a great 180 where everyone is open to having this dialogue now, and youth providers and the folks that are on the ground are excited to engage with kids. The biggest question is how, and there's actually not enough training out there to train these folks in that. And that's anyone that's working at the Boys and Girls Clubs on the front lines, to some of the sports organizations that Up2Us Sports work with, right? But I always believe that starts within the workplace. And so today, the first thing really is I just want to do some discussion around pronouns, because I think pronouns is a very low hanging fruit for folks to talk about and have conversations. I think the one thing before we have this discussion is that, number one, you're going to mess up. And it's okay. And I think that the community itself and being in the community is very understandable. For me in our generation, the word queer was a no-go. It was a slur word. A lot of people didn't like it. And now the next generation of kids is using it more to reclaim. So the community is always changing. It's LGBTQIA-2. And so I just don't want people to get all word soupy on some of this stuff. I think some basics today and conversations around pronouns could help at least start the conversation in the workplace. So with that, Kim, I think you can share my screen. Yes. Cool. So just a quick icebreaker. Everyone has a personal and social identity. Personal identities include an individual's name, unique characteristics, history, personality, and other traits that make one person different from others. Social identity includes affinities one has with other people, values, norms that one accepts, and the ways one has learned to behave in social settings. So when we talk about pronouns, we're talking about identity essentially. And so within our spaces, how we have conversations with kids and folks that work at Rainbow Labs is first, who are you? What are the identities? Primarily because just because you're LGBTQ or in the community doesn't necessarily mean that's your sole and focused identity. And so I'd love to just open up some conversation. Anyone wants to share with a few of the questions I have out there, which is, who gave you your nickname? Do you have a nickname? What is that name? Why is it? Do you have any other nicknames? And if so, how did you get them? And what are the 3 most important aspects of your identity? And so would anyone like to share about either their name or a nickname that they have? Not everyone at once.
One thing I think is interesting about my full name is Kimberly, and my dad is the only person who calls me that. And growing up, I'm assuming that's what everyone around me called me, because there's home videos where everyone calls me Kimberly. But then at some point, somebody started calling me Kim, and then that is what I've just identified for moving forward. But I don't know when that transition happened. I don't know if a teacher at school just started calling me that, so that's what I went by. But I think it's really interesting because my family and my dad never call me Kim, and I've claimed that as my name. So someone gave it to me, and I just clung on to it. So I think that's interesting.
That's so interesting, Kim. I have a similar experience I'll share. So I'm Jacob, and people love to shorten my name to Jake. It's just what it is, and it's just a common, common shortening of it. The only person in my life that's ever given me that nickname is my dad. He loved watching WWE wrestling in the early 90s with Jake the Snake, and so I only allow him. He's the only person in my life that has I allow passage to have Jake. Otherwise, I'm constantly correcting people when they want to shorten my name to a nickname, and so it's similar, Kim, right? It's I was just given this sort of shortened nickname because of sort of the society and folks around us, and it takes a little bit of time to push back. anyone else want to share about a name or a nickname that they've been given, and then how and why?
I can share. My name's Stephanie, and surprisingly, nobody really calls me Steph or anything like that. But I got my first nickname. I think I might have been 13, and I used to spend a lot of time. 'Cause I'm a writer, so I used to spend a lot of time at the beach, and so they would always call me, "Oh, you're such a mermaid! You're such a mermaid!" And so then I was introduced to an American poet, which is James Douglas Morrison, known as the Doors lead singer. I picked up a book, and they connected it. They're like, you're just gonna be a poet, aren't you? You're Mermaid Morrison. And since I've been 13, that's been my nickname. If it's not Mermaid, it's Morrison. And it's always been like that. And I'm nearly 40 years old. So it's been a really long time, but it's stuck to me and I'm proud of it. And that's what they know me as.
I love that. Thanks so much, Stephanie, for sharing. Can we get two other folks to share?
Yeah, I can go. So my mum wanted to name me after McKeely Jones, who was some like Australian triathlete or something, and they originally spelled my name differently, but then the nurses couldn't pronounce it. So then she tried to spell it McKaylee, which she thought people would understand. But actually, I can probably count on like one hand the amount of people who have pronounced it right the first time they've met me, which I don't really care about because I know they'll spell it wrong. And then in terms of nicknames, in Australia, I was always called Macca, but I don't really go by that in the US because it feels like a very Australian shortening of a word, and I can't imagine like Americans saying it per se. So I don't have a nickname in America, only Australia.
That's so interesting how you crossed cultures, right? And sometimes, especially when we talk about names, depending on the amount of time that you have to explain why your name is what it is, also condenses down, you know, how you sort of address folks and how they want to address you. So it's interesting how we go through some of these emotions, right? And how when we stick up and what's most important for us as our name goes, like when those moments are most appropriate. Can we get one other person to share?
We have a couple shares in the chat.
Oh, great.
Any of those people want to pop up?
Kim, can you read them to me? Because
Sure.
because I'm screen sharing, I can't.
Yeah, Eric Baker says it's not really a nickname, but the majority of people address me by my last name, which is Bakes, short for Baker. And then Max Bova. This is my full name is Max Bova, but I go by Max usually, and my parents call me Bova more often. Professionally, first time meeting people, they try to use my full name before I can tell them to use Max. And then Rebecca said, my name was given to me by my dad, and I've been given multiple nicknames. My family calls me Becca, but then Becky, but then there's Becca, Reeb, Cece, or Reb, I don't know, I might have got that one wrong, because there are two other girls with the name Rebecca in the family. They're spelled differently.
I love it. And Kim, I just found the chat too, so you don't have to continually read that. I can save you some time. Well, awesome. So I think, for the folks that did share, the next part of this icebreaker is, what are the three most important aspects of your identity? So we talked a little bit about nicknames, right? And sometimes they come from culture, sometimes they come from other parts of your identity. We heard about poetry, we heard about like another country. And so, I think this sort of determines how we identify with the ways that people address us. And so does someone want to share about what the three most important aspects of your identity are?
Also feel free to throw them in the chat.
Yep, you can also put in the chat. And I'll give an example, Kim, for folks, right? So for identity, for me, I think the first thing for me as aspects of identity is family. Like, I think family is an extremely important aspect to, who I am as a person, how I identify, and just like uplifting family. Another aspect I think is, really important for me is being like community centric, right? So knowing my neighbors, being an extrovert, having conversation with and wanting to give back, right? And the third is sort of just like culturally, it's split between two families. My mom's family is from Pennsylvania, so I have a whole Pennsylvania culture situation going on. And then my dad's side is from Louisiana. And so there's like this Cajun identity that's really fun and loving. And I constantly have to explain it to people what it means. My last name is Toops. And so oftentimes there's a lot of questions around my last name. Is it French? Is it not French? So there's a whole conversation around that. And so those are three, right? Being both like family, being community centric as far as identity goes. And then third, just some like cultural stuff. Does anyone else want to share some aspects of their own identity? Oh, I love that, Rebecca. My name was given to me based off a character in a TV show.
I can go. I think distilling identity into three things is sort of hard, which is why maybe some people are, it's sort of hard to be like, okay, what are the three things? But the first thing that came to my mind is the fact that I identify as a woman or as a female, and that is part of my core identity. One, because I went to all-girl high school that my mom went to, and so like that was really part of my core. But it's also something I'm really proud of and something I really embrace and love about myself. And then the second thing that came to my mind was just that I love to be crafty and try new things, so more related to the things and the hobbies that I like to do. I love to crochet, I love to be artistic, and I guess the third one, similar to you, Jacob, being family oriented and really having family at the core of my identity as well.
Cool. I love that. Thanks so much for sharing. And if we get one more person to share, and then we're going to jump into the next part.
I'll try.
Yeah.
I'll give it a go. I was thinking this is such an insightful icebreaker question. I'm over here reflecting like hardcore. Yeah. I'd say like one, definitely like helping, like giving back, like trying to do anything I can to like help the people under me, like next generation, whether it's teaching, coaching, whatever. Is definitely something I always strive to do. And then building off on that, definitely, you know, being athletic, being involved in sports, moving, things like that, I definitely draw a lot from. And like, I guess the third one is just being like hardworking, just constantly just going and doing what I need to do and not really boasting or bragging about what I'm doing. It's something I always draw a lot from and how I identify myself.
Yeah, it's a lot to think about when you're thinking about identity, right? Like, what are my top three things? I love Stephanie saying being full-time mom, mentoring youth, and writing kids books. That's amazing. And I think, you know, we bring this into conversation because it's so important within the LGBTQ space to think about identity. And I'll give you a great example. We have a program out here we partner with in Los Angeles called Mi Centro. It's in East LA, and East Los Angeles is mostly Latino population. And so they're kind of, their identities and the population they're working with are kids in the LGBTQ space, but also being immigrants, also Spanish speaking, right? Also, you know, maybe religious oriented, right? So there's just so many different layers to their identity. So when we're thinking about introducing ourselves to other folks, there's so many things that are wrapped into that. And why this conversation, oh, Stephanie is from East Los, yeah. And why I have this conversation about identity is moving into the next part, which is just like important terms. This is crazy. I don't want to go so much into this. But I want to just show that like identity is encompassed in so many different things in the LGBTQ space. So you've got like sexual orientation, which is like someone's sexual orientation can change over time. There's some conversations around like gender identity and gender expression and AFAB and non-binary. And there's just a lot that we all want to just digest at once. And what I would say is that like, you don't need to be an expert. I think a lot of people, even in the space, don't even know a lot of this stuff, to be honest, especially that like gender non-binary. All of that stuff is really, really new to folks, let's just say like 30 up. That concept of understanding that like you can be gender fluid, you know, all that stuff. It doesn't mean it can't happen. It just means that it's just like a re-education piece. So I think the most thing that I can distill on everyone having a conversation today about all these terms is, by the way, everyone within the community is also learning all of this stuff too, which is why I want to encourage anyone that if you have questions about these kinds of things that we can have like continued conversation and ask about that. And so what we're learning around the kid space is that a lot of kids are very, very, very focused on gender right now, gender expression and non-binary. And as you get older, there's less focus on that. So when we're having conversations about, being inclusive in the workplace, finding non-binary people or who people identify may be a little bit more struggling because those folks never went through this opportunity through a cultural movement where gender can change, like conversations around this. And one thing we were getting from kids, and why it's important to think about your workplace and bringing this into your development and your marketing, right? Or fundraising, or whatever you're doing in your VISTA positions, is that there is a generational divide that's happening right now. And that's just because there's like not a common link. And so one is, this really interesting notion about when you come into the community, that there is a notion right now that you should just be able to identify yourself very quickly, like I'm lesbian or I'm gay or I'm trans. And that's not really how the process works. The process generally works that folks come out and then they have a conversation about what they think they identify with. And then they move through the motions of, well, maybe I'm not that. As I've gotten to know more people in the trans community, or I've gotten to know more people on the non-binary community, I actually think I'm this way. And the reason why that exists right now in the space is that there's no manual. And one thing that we learned from the kids when we're shaping our program is the need or the hunger for information. I'll give you a quick example. There was a TikTok that went around showing a lesbian manifesto, and kids had put together this Google Doc to find out whether or not they were a lesbian. And that's so fascinating for folks within the community because there really isn't something written down where kids can kind of figure this stuff out. And so kids had compiled this, like a checklist of like this and this and a flow chart and all kinds of crazy things, but it's because they were just so hungry to figure out themselves. And I think that's why it's so important, whether you're an advocate, and I use the word advocate over ally, because advocates really stand up for folks in the community, or you're in the community, is the fact that it's very fluid because there's not enough information about being A, B, or C within the community. It generally comes from person-to-person interaction and experiences that you have with other folks. So here's like a layout of all the terms in the community, which I'll give to Kim. And if you want to go more into it, you can do that on your own. And then I just want to talk a little bit about pronouns and names that are preferred and they're right. So a few things like within the workplace, right, or conversations you're having with people. The three major pronouns, we've got them listed there. I think that the second best tip is never assume someone's pronouns, and also model behavior in the workplace. Hi, I'm Jake. I use he, him, his pronouns. How about you? Chosen names, this is like a tip, are the names in which the trans and non-binary individuals use that are not assigned at birth, right? And so, these are sometimes chosen names are different than their legal names. And so I think that's important to note, especially when you're interacting with folks in the community, in your workplace or whatever it might be, if they're trans, that they have these things called death names or death days, where they've actually like laid to rest their old identity or their old name, and they've now assumed a chosen name. Why I think like it's so important to understand is that like not only is the process about changing names really challenging as a person-to-person interaction, but I'll give you one thing that I even learned 3 months ago, which is that trans people have a really hard time changing their names in like bank accounts because they don't, most banks across the US, financial institutions don't really recognize them. And so by simply changing your name on your debit card or your credit card or your bank account is a huge hurdle that takes like 3 to 6 months sometimes. And so those are some low level things that when we think about names and we think about how they impact the community, like that's one just like system or institution that hasn't evolved over time. And the last is misgendering, is when you use an incorrect pronoun to address someone. So if you acknowledge the mistake or promise to correct them, again, like I said, everyone is extremely forgiving. I love that everyone's taking a risk today and they're talking about their identities in a very supportive way. But I think the most important thing to understand is that you're probably going to mess up. It's okay. Correct yourself, and then you'll learn like next time, right? I think that as we interact with folks in the workplace, everyone's just really understanding on that. And the last that I just want to go through, this is a little bit that Kim and I talked about, like working with youth, but it also applies to a lot within the workplace too. And I think the biggest thing is, the more that you can try to learn about folks in the community and build strong connections with them, and I say it in youth, but it's also in the workplace, the more accepting they're going to feel. I think privacy is extremely important. If someone in the community shares something with you about their identity, ask if it's okay to share that. Never assume that you can go to the next coworker or someone in the space and say, hey, have you met Jake? He's a trans man. His story is really amazing, because we always have to remember that it's their story to tell. It's not our story. And so you always want to ask folks that. And then provide interpersonal support. And we say to students, but to people within the workplace too, right? Like talking about their identity, navigating decisions, and disclosing or concealing it with others. The other things that you can foster, right, is just like, for us, we have like create GSAs at schools, but I think within the workplace, we're seeing a lot of diversity and inclusion teams like Pride networks and other places that involve both advocates and folks in the community. And it's growing. I'll say, like, after George Floyd, there's been an explosion. Everyone from American Airlines to Hilton, everyone's now jumping on the bandwagon to create pride groups within their companies. It doesn't mean they figured it out. I'll just tell everyone that. I think it's all really, really new. And I think workplace inclusion for LGBTQ is still relatively new. And so just kind of know that, understand that if you create like a subgroup within your organization of folks, I think Kim when I was at Up2Us Sports, we actually had what we call the Rainbow Coalition, which is like a few folks that were a part of the LGBTQ community. And it's just like fun. And it was nothing like really official, sort of an unofficial group of conversation. But that's like one way that folks can advocate for each other within the space. And then, I think the last thing I just want to share is about the coming out experience, and why Rainbow Labs was launched. Was primarily because when I was at Up2Us Sports, we had a lot of our coaches in the field that were interacting with kids, and kids were coming out to their sports coaches. And this is in 2011. And it was really interesting. And I think what gets funneled up is the fact that there wasn't training at these youth providers and workplaces during that time about coming out conversations. I think we talk about trauma-informed care a lot at Up2Us Sports. And so how do we make sure that we are trauma-informed? When we think about coming out, can be a very, very traumatic experience. And these are a lot of conversations we're having even in our own spaces. I will tell you that mental health in the LGBTQ space is very new. Not a lot of people have talked about it. Because we just haven't gotten to that point within the community. We're pretty behind. So I think like a coming out experience, just note, can also be traumatic depending on if they're 16 or they're coming out to you in the workplace. And I'll say that HRC Human Rights Campaign had said that about 60% of our community is out in the workplace, which means about 40% are not. And so just keep that in the back of your mind, that we are still on this like upslope of how do we create diversity and inclusion for the LGBT community in the workplace. But a few things, and I'll leave these slides with Kim and all of you, is when someone comes out to you, there's a few just tips. Like, don't say, I always knew, really bad. Really downplays the significance of what they're trying to tell you. They're in a very vulnerable position at that point. You've earned their trust. And so do not say, I always knew, because although it's funny and it can be interesting, and it may feel like you're connecting with someone on a deeper level, it comes off as artificial. The second is like, don't tell anyone unless you're given permission. Like I had said earlier, if someone comes out to you, do not go to a friend or even a family member. You want to create protection and safety for the folks within the community. Don't ask probing questions. And that moment when they come out to you, it's not the time for you to ask a bunch of questions. It might be a time for just to listen and hear through their experiences. And I think we talk about open-ended questions, right, a lot, like how are you doing, just keeping it very open dialogue. Do know that it's like a huge sign of trust if they do come out to you in the workplace. Huge sign. Do check in on confidentiality around identity, and do ask them how you can best support them. I think that's really great, right? So if you're the first person in the workplace to come out, like, just know that that was a huge leap, and that it may take some time for them to trust other people within the space, but you might be the first. So those are a few tips if folks do come out to you in the workplace, or we're thinking about diversity and inclusion, it may happen. And just know that we're seeing more and more of this happen over time. As I said, 60% are coming out, 40% aren't out yet. But I think this is really important as we think through how do we create like safe and supportive environments for the folks in the community. So that's all I've got, Kim. I think that We talked a little bit about the original activity about names and changing your names. And if you think through that, sometimes, like Kim had mentioned, other folks, that sometimes your name was given to you, and they weren't, it was like assigned to you maybe, or someone else gave it to you, how uncomfortable you felt, and how you felt like you weren't able to tell your own story and narrative. And I would suggest to reflect on those times in which people have called you things in which you didn't feel very safe or comfortable with. And that is a very similar feeling that people in the community feel. So just know that. I think you don't have to be in the community to know what that feels like. And so I really wanted to get that across as we talked about identities, and how to create like this safe, important environment, or safe, supportive environment within the workplace. Kim, can I take this question from Eric?
Yeah, we still have about 5 minutes.
Yeah, I think so. Eric, your question on what are your feelings on the feeling that we must label people, and that there's a lot of pressure to fit in a label. I completely agree. I think just know within the community itself that traditionally this is what has happened. So there's even transformation happening within the community itself about being cis, bi, gay, whatever it might be. There's something that we're trying to rip away from right now, that's common inside and outside the community, which is the phrase bi now and gay later, which discounts people's experiences and says, don't worry, you're bi now, but later you're going to become gay, and that's just how it is. And that is extremely it's extremely limiting, and it shuts people down completely in their own experience, right? It's invalidating to them. And so I'll say, like, that is a perfect example of how even internally in the community, we're trying to put people in boxes because it makes more sense in a certain way. And I think most importantly, Eric, like we just talked about non-binary, that new like category of people has like a lot of people in the community just like mind blowing. Not that we don't want to validate, but just like wrapping your head around that kind of experience. Thanks, Eric, for your question. I hope that helps. Any other questions? Or thoughts or comments, or I don't know, maybe some realization?
Jacob, I just appreciate your time and, everything that you shared. I am a bisexual woman, and I'm the only person that in my entire family, in my mom's and my father's. My mother till this day doesn't accept me, but she loves me still. So it's just, but thank you so much for this. This is really good and refreshing to see that you're doing something great for us. And I appreciate you very much.
Yeah, of course, Stephanie. And I think that, folks on this call, the ways they can walk away is like hearing stories of yours, but also recognizing that it starts with us in here and having these open conversations. So creating safe and supportive spaces for all kinds of people is the start of a conversation.
Well, we have about 5 minutes left, so we can just kind of hang out, Jacob and myself. And if anyone has any other questions that they want to ask, like, we'll be around for the next few minutes. But we really do appreciate everyone coming today and joining the conversation, and definitely hearing from Kristen, Kayla at Move United, and then Jacob today from Rainbow Labs. We will send out the slides from Jacob and the information from them as well. But thank you all so much for joining. We'll hang out for the next couple minutes, but we will see everyone next month for the second part of the creativity training that we started in June, I believe. So we'll see everyone next month, and we'll hang out. And if anyone has anything else, feel free to get off mute or pop it in the chat.
Jacob, I have a question quick. First of all, thanks for this presentation. It was super awesome. It's super, super awesome. And I just loved every second of it. I was wondering, I just wanted to brainstorm and pick your brain about, I've heard a couple of different perspectives just about pronouns and how people introduce themselves with pronouns, because I have a couple of queer friends, like my sister even, who she has said that she doesn't understand, or she doesn't feel like it's right to introduce pronouns when you're first meeting someone, because it might obligate someone else to introduce themselves with pronouns if they're not necessarily comfortable specifying what they are yet. And so I was just wondering what your thoughts were on that. Eric's question kind of prompted that for me, because I kind of saw how it maybe trying to force people into a certain label or something like that, even though there are non-binary pronouns. But I don't know. That's not really a structured question, but I just wanted to know your thoughts on that.
Yeah, it's very trendy right now to just like put your pronouns and like I have it in the Zoom, or you can do it, on your email or whatever it might be. And I think that when you display your pronouns, it's like a signal to folks like accepting like and having like open conversations and dialogue about what that really means. And so in some ways I think it actually opens the door for conversation. In other ways it feels like a little bit forced, and I think depending on who you are, like I don't think that you should force people to use their pronouns. But I do think that over time we're going to hear more and more about pronouns and uses, especially with like gender non-binary, because those folks like they, and we've have like it, and we have other kinds of things that are coming through, are really important. And a lot of youth now, especially the folks that are 18 and under, really are emphasizing pronouns. So I think for folks that are 18 and older, it's a learning curve and it feels pressured, but I think it helps build a foundation for the next generation of folks.
Awesome. Thanks, Jacob. That was helpful.
Yeah. Of course. It is. It's something we all have to get used to. And I will say one thing we didn't discuss a little bit today about pronouns is there's a huge movement that's happening in language right now. So Spanish and ella, and like using some things that aren't traditional. I'll say that like pronouns are upending old cultural heritage that's been around for quite some time. And even like I'll say like the Latino population is having conversations about how does this fit within our culture? It's upending all of our ancestors and what they brought to us. And there's just some dialogue about like, is that necessary? How important are these things? And how do we still honor heritage while at the same time respecting the folks who don't fit into like old traditional boxes? So the jury is still out on a lot of pronouns because it's still a movement that we've been pushing the last 5 years. It's still pretty new. Oh, I love that, Rebecca. People first language is being implemented as well. I love that.
Awesome. Well, Jacob, thank you so much. Do you care if I give people your information if they have any more questions?
No, not at all. Please, I'll put it in here too.
Jacob's gonna put that in the chat, but then also we'll put it in the follow-up email that comes out with the recording and all of that. But again, thanks everyone so much for joining. We truly do appreciate it. You taking the time out of your day to learn a little bit more about this, and we will see everyone next month. Thank you all so much.